Hi, everybody. Alex is going to introduce herself more formally in a few minutes, but on behalf of all of the teachers in the Postback program here at Kean, we just want to thank you so much for being with us this evening. Having used your sources in our classrooms, we are both very excited and honored to have you here with us tonight, and we look forward to learning alongside you. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I wish I could see all of you at the same time, but I'll scroll through the pages and so that hopefully I can see your faces when you're asking questions, which I hope you will during the course of this session. What we are going to do today, this evening, is I'm going to spend about 45 minutes talking about the sort of background of Salvaged Pages, how I was able to collect the material and what it represents, both historically and for educators. And during that time, I would encourage you to ask questions. You can put them in the chat. I think, Jackie, is that the best way for people to do it? Okay, so if you've got a question while I'm going, put it in the chat. I may not see it. So I'm going to try to leave time at the end, but also, Jackie, if at any point you want to like kind of break in and ask a question that seems particularly pertinent, feel free. I'm a very informal person, so I don't mind that at all. Then from about 5:15 to 5:45, we're going to do an in-depth close reading of one of the diary entries in Salvaged Pages. And we're going to talk about it both from a literary and a historical standpoint, and I'm going to try to model a little bit how you can have a conversation, a discussion in your classroom about a diary that has something to say, both from a historical standpoint and also a little bit from a literary one. Then we're going to take a little break. And then when we come back, we're going to go into breakout groups. I've got a number of different diary entries. You're going to be in small groups and be able to use Padlet to discuss them among yourselves. And then we'll come back together and kind of process how that went, what worked, what didn't work, were there problems that you ran into, what did you think about the questions, all that kind of thing. And then we'll wrap up. So we've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to go ahead and dive in. The Salvaged Pages, the story of Salvaged Pages is actually kind of a now, at this point in 2021, a long story. I came to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as a junior staff person in 1991. I had just graduated from Smith College with a bachelor's in art history and French literature. And I had never studied the Holocaust. I didn't know anything about the Holocaust, actually, other than like a very superficial introduction to it in religious school. But I had a strong background as a researcher. And so I was hired to be on the founding staff of the museum as the researcher for Remember the Children, Daniel's Story, which is an exhibition that many of you may know. It's the museum's exhibition for young visitors. And at the time, okay, I'm at home like all of you. You will hear my dog. My children will wander in. They will ask me if they can have a snack. Things will happen. We're going to just go with it. No matter how many times I say not to do that, it still happens. So I was hired to work on Remember the Children, Daniel's Story. And for those of you who've seen the exhibition, you know that the exhibition is told in the form of a diary, Daniel's diary. And in order to write the exhibition script, I was asked to have a look at diaries that had been kept by teenagers during the Holocaust. And at the time, there were about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 diaries that had been translated into English and published. And really, for me, like this was not a topic that I had ever really thought about at all. But my boss said, we're going to write this exhibition text in the form of a diary. So let's read diaries and see, what did kids write about? How did they describe their experiences? Maybe we'll get a sense of like the flavor of the language for the exhibition. So I went back and reread the Diary of Anne Frank, which I had read in middle school. And then I went to the museum's library and asked the librarian what was available. And what he handed me was this stack of 7 or 8 volumes. These were all diaries that, as I said, had been published in English, and they had all, with the exception of the Diary of Anne Frank, gone out of print. And so I took them back to my office and I started reading them. And, I was completely stunned by this material. I mean, I had never read anything like it before. And by this time, I'd been at the museum for about 6 months. I was pretty well immersed in Holocaust, scholarship of many different kinds. I had read a lot of history by this time. I had looked at a lot of photographs. I'd seen oral testimonies. I'd seen film footage. But there was something about these diaries that kind of cut through the time and made me feel like I was in the moment, experiencing what the writer had experienced in real time. And it really was a very powerful, visceral experience. And at the time, what I remember is thinking to myself, these diaries are so incredible and they're so powerful and they're so interesting and they're so nuanced and the individual voices are so unique. Why have I never heard of any of these other diaries? Why is it that with a reasonably good education, a good high school, good college, like a reasonably well-rounded person at 21, it had never occurred to me that anybody other than Anne Frank had written a diary. The thought had simply never crossed my mind. And, as often happens, sort of on the face of it, when you ask a question like that, you sort of think, well, now that I think about it, that is bananas. Like, how could that be that there's only one diary of a teenager that survived out of millions of young people who lived this experience? That makes no sense. Why is that? And so this was a question that began to preoccupy me. And at the same time, I was very interested in, why were these diaries published and then they went out of print? Why didn't I or anybody else seem to know about them? Were they really different from Anne Frank's diary in a meaningful way, or were they like her diary in some way that I couldn't recognize? Were there threads or themes that ran through the whole body of material, that could sort of bring the material together? And I think probably above all, the question that really remained with me was, are there more diaries like this out there? Is this it? Or if I started looking, might I find more material? And so that's what I did. I was working as a researcher, and I began trying to find other diaries written by other teenagers. And I was in a very lucky position because being at the Holocaust Museum in 1991, 92, 93 on the founding staff meant that everybody who had anything to do with Holocaust scholarship was connected to the museum. And people were donating their documents to the museum on a weekly basis. People were giving oral testimonies. Scholars were doing their work. People in the library and archives were in touch with everyone around the world who had anything to do with the Holocaust. So it was sort of centralized in a way. And that meant that I was right in the middle of, all these spokes that made the research possible for me in a way that would have been incredibly difficult if I had been on my own. And over the years, while I was doing this research, people finally, over time, people started to know that I was interested because I would ask questions and, I'd reach out to the historians and say, I'm interested in this subject. Who should I write to? What are the main archives in Poland? Who should I write to? Or who should I write to in Lithuania? Or, do you know anybody in the Jewish community in Greece that I can contact? And so people started to find out that I was interested in this. And once that happened, then when people, and this was within a year or two, when people would donate their diaries, for example, to the museum, the collections people would give me a call and they would say, oh, we just got a new diary was dropped off, or we received something, we're accessioning it, would you like to come down and see it? So gradually this list that I had of diaries started to grow. And, you know, it was 7 or 8, and then it was 12, and then it was 18, and then it was 25. And at a certain point I realized I'm in trouble now, because I have this growing body of material and it's kind of getting away from me. You know, bearing in mind that I was in my early 20s, I didn't have a PhD, I was fluent in French, but no other languages. And I wasn't an expert, a scholar on the Holocaust. So the tremendous challenge, I mean, there were so many challenges about this book and putting this material together, but a big part of it was gathering the material, getting the material translated if it wasn't translated into English, and then reading these, what amounted to thousands of pages of diaries, and trying to figure out, like, what does this body of material represent? What is this? Like, is this, you know, what does it contribute, you know, sort of on its own terms? And there are a lot of things to say about this, and I'm going to try to kind of, because we have a little more time than usual, I'm going to try to touch on as many of them as I can. And then hopefully some of the other things that if I don't get to them, they'll come up in our discussions. The first thing is that when you begin a research project like this, you have to kind of contend with this question of, what is this genre? What's in the genre? What's out of the genre? And what's sort of on the margins, right? So I was interested in diaries, young people, and the Holocaust. That was like the Venn diagram was those three things. But I had, because that was the Venn diagram, there are a lot of things that are sort of on the border of that. So for example, there's diary and there's memoir, right? Diary is written in real time as events occur without a knowledge of the outcome, whereas a memoir is written after events have occurred and in retrospect. And both of them yield very different things. You know, the great thing about a diary is that there's a lot of immediate, up to the, like, detailed day-to-day kind of texture of daily life. But the person writing the diary doesn't have any historical perspective. They're sort of limited by what they know from inside the circumstances. Whereas memoir, you have the benefit of retrospect, you know what happened, you know the broader history, you have access to all kinds of supporting resources, but you tend to lose the immediacy of writing in the moment. But it's not like there's only memoir and diary. There are things, what do you do with something, for example, that was written by a child who's a refugee leaving on a, you know, leaving for America, on the boat to America. So they're out, right? It's 1943. They're out of danger, and they're recapping everything that happened over the last 4 years. Is that a diary or is that a memoir? There were a lot of things that sort of fell in that gray area. And so there was some contending that I had to do with that. Likewise, there's the Holocaust and there's World War II. So a Jewish teenager writing in Vilna Ghetto is clearly a victim of the Holocaust. A non-Jewish teenager living through the bombing of Rotterdam, for example, is clearly writing about World War II. But what do you do about a Polish non-Jew living in the general government in Poland? That's right on the border. This is a person who was persecuted by the Nazis, but not as a Jew, as a Pole, and also living through the war. So again, there was this gray area. How do you navigate that? And then finally, the third gray area, and the one that is the most interesting and the most difficult, is the question of age. Who is a child? And when are you no longer a child? Lord knows, if we could answer that question, we would all probably sleep a lot better at night. You know, clearly somebody who's 12 or 14 or 15 is a, you know, they're teenagers. And clearly someone who's married, you know, at 25 and has a child is an adult. But what do you do with a 21-year-old who's still living with his or her parents under their roof, not making his or her own decisions for him or herself? And what do you do with a 26-year-old who is completely living alone and directing all, surviving by his wits, or for that matter, a 15-year-old? So again, there are these gray areas. And one of the things that I did in Salvaged Pages, for those of you who have the book, is I wrote an entire essay at the end of the book on these gray areas, trying to grapple with this idea of sort of what's in, what's out, and what's on the margins. And you could ask yourself sort of, why does this matter? Who cares? But the reason it matters is because if you are going to sort of identify a genre, which is what this is, you have to put like things with like things. If you put like things with unlike things, then you sort of screw up the sense of what it yields or what it contributes. So I had to wrestle with that. Now, I will say, I think it's really important to say that had I found diaries that were written by young people who were targeted for genocide by the Nazis for reasons other than being Jewish, I would, like, let's say a gypsy, like a Roma or Sinti, which is very unlikely since obviously those are oral traditions, not written traditions typically, or a person who had a physical disability. Those would have fit, but I didn't find any of that material. Some things that are close to that have surfaced over the years, but really the broadest body of material were Jewish teenagers. And so that's what I ended up focusing on. One of the amazing things that happened as I was doing this work was within this is like for anybody here who's ever done a research project, there's this really challenging time where you're gathering information, you're sort of culling through, you're figuring out what your lens is, what's in, what's out. But then within that, there can be an enormous diversity of information. So there's sort of this expanding and contracting kind of process that happens. And where I was trying to contract and get some type of handle on the material in terms of the genre, I was challenged in a really wonderful way by this enormous diversity of material, even within the limits that I was setting in order to try to understand it. And so I just want to speak for a minute about that. One of the limitations of the fame of Anne Frank's diary is that her diary represents one experience of one young girl, right, in Amsterdam, in hiding, highly assimilated teenager, living with her family in Western Europe. And as I began collecting these diaries, what I found was that there was anytime I felt like I could kind of generalize, like, oh, most of these kinds of kids wrote diaries, or diaries were written by these kinds of people, something would show up that would kind of poke a hole in the theory. So the diaries represent, they're written from young people all across the continent of Europe in nearly every language that you can imagine. There are young people as young as 12, and the oldest one in the book is 21. There are boys and girls. There are big families. There are small families. They're everywhere along the political spectrum. There are young people who are Orthodox, from Orthodox Jewish families, highly, highly observant, all the way to young people who were children of a mixed marriage, or one boy who was converted to Catholicism, who was a practicing Catholic, and everything in between, including many young writers who were either very assimilated and very acculturated, who felt very little connection to their Jewish identity, or Jewish children young people who were very culturally identified as Jews, or very identified within their community as Jews, but were not religiously observant. There were, young people in rural areas, young people in urban areas, urban centers, wealthy, poor, peasants, children of journalists and doctors, everything you could possibly imagine. And so the question you know, the exciting thing, of course, was that the more I found, the more diversity, the better, in terms of offering different viewpoints on the experience of the Holocaust. But the challenge became, you know, what's the organizing principle of this body of material? How do you look at it as anything other than a random set of fragments that happen to survive? And how can you tie it together to make it useful? So in order to talk about that, I need to digress for 1 minute and talk about Anne Frank, because although this isn't necessarily always the case, in the case of this particular work, there's no way to talk about these diaries without talking about Anne Frank and the way that Anne Frank's diary has been framed, in particular in American life. So you all know that Anne Frank's diary was published in 1952 in English. It was an instant bestseller, immediately very beloved. There was then a Broadway play and a film made of the diary. And the way that Anne Frank's diary was framed, and this probably won't be very new to you, it was sort of a new idea when I was grappling with this back in the 90s. It is now no longer really a new idea, but the diary was framed in this sort of redemptive, like a fundamentally redemptive framework, right? So Anne Frank, diaries are, I'm going to say now what the belief structure is. Diaries are personal, private documents in which people pour their heart and soul. They like pour themselves into these diaries, and it's like a vessel for the true self of the writer. And therefore, the survival of a diary is like the survival of the person itself, that the person, whether it's Anne Frank or some other diarist, transcends death by the diary surviving, right? That's number one. Number two, Anne Frank was so eloquent. She was such a beautiful writer. She so profoundly captured the essence of what it meant to be persecuted as a Jew in the Holocaust, that she spoke for millions and millions of young people who didn't keep diaries. And thirdly, Anne Frank expressed in her diary a hope for humanity, a fundamentally optimistic view that, in fact, human beings were good, despite all evidence to the contrary, in the Holocaust. And by doing so, she gave us all the ability to believe in the fundamental goodness of people. That if Anne Frank could say that people were good, it must be true. And she thereby redeemed humanity for the evil that took her life. That's the basic framework. And you can read in the introduction to Salvaged Pages where that came from. Its point of origin really is the 1952 review of Anne Frank's diary that was published by Meyer Levin in the New York Times. And it's all there. What was so interesting for me was that when I started finding these published editions of diaries, I kept running into this same language. You know, the writer lives on after his or her death. The writer transcends the evil that took his or her life. The writer speaks for all the others who didn't live to write diaries. The writer's diary represents the triumph of the human spirit. This language like clung to every diary that was published after Anne Frank's diary. And for whatever reason, that language was deeply, deeply offensive to me. I don't know if it was because I was sort of coming to this in my early 20s and I was suddenly thrown into this research and it was very intense and very shocking. And there was kind of a disconnect there, or if it was because I felt so identified with these young writers. But whatever it was, I felt my response to that was like, no, no, and no. You know, no, they don't live on after their diaries. To the contrary, all that's left of these young lives is 50 pages or 75 pages. Imagine if somebody found 50 pages of your writing that you wrote when you were 18. Would you think that that represented all of who you were, all your hopes and your dreams and your values and your wishes and your goals and your family and your story? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. What this is it's a fragment of a life. It stands as a fragment of a life. It's valuable, it's meaningful, but it does not stand in for a life. Likewise, how could we ever say that one writer spoke for millions? We can't even say that one person. I mean, I think about this all the time when I present to teachers. Like, think about your classroom. Think about choosing one student from your classroom who would be the representative of all of them. It's patently absurd. And you know that when you read these diaries, because each voice is so different, so unique and so individual, and not just their personalities or their experience or their families, but just like the way that we think and the way that we are is completely unique. And so the tragedy is that the surviving remnant of diaries, even whether it's 7 or 8 or 100 of them, is still a fragment of the whole. And then the third piece of the puzzle is this idea of redemption. And the idea that somehow an expression of hope in a diary sort of lets us all off the hook for what we know to be true about the Holocaust, which is that if humanity were so good, then we wouldn't be studying these diaries to begin with. That humanity is good and it is bad, and individuals are good and they are evil. They're both. And one of the ways in which this kind of became so clear in the diaries is that there's so much, the theme of hope and despair runs through all of them. And one young person can be hopeful one day and despairing the next, and hopeful the next day after that. And the idea that there is somehow sort of a moral good assigned to hopefulness, that to be hopeful is to be moral, that you are somehow a better person for being hopeful, begs the question, well, then what if you are despairing? Surely we don't want to say that people who felt despair were morally bad or were failing in some way. What comes through in these diaries is that there's a constant vacillation, and hope is fragile, and people feel hope for reasons that are hard to explain and feel despair for reasons that are hard to explain. So the challenge for me was to dismantle this paradigm, which in itself was difficult to do because it's always hard to dismantle a paradigm. But then to think, well, okay, but if individual diaries don't stand in for their writers, if the surviving diaries don't represent all the children who were lost, and if they don't give us hope for humanity, then what do they do? What are they for? What framework could be constructed that would make sense? And in the end, the framework that I adopted, what I came to believe, was that young writers' diaries should be viewed and studied and considered exactly the way that adult diaries are. That what had basically happened with Anne Frank's diary was that it was turned into a symbol of her life, a symbol of a generation, a symbol of hope. But that kind of devalues the actual information and the actual practice of writing that Anne Frank engaged in. She wrote actual words. It's not like a shoe, right? That is like a symbol. She actually wrote things, and you can read what she wrote and you can learn from what she wrote. Well, this is what it was like for this person to be in this place in this particular time, with these talents, with these abilities, with these limitations. And each individual diary does that. And what makes them so amazing is that they are both historical records and literary records at the same time. So let's talk about that for a minute. From a historical standpoint, and this is where it matters for you as teachers the most, because these diaries are just like crying out to be used as primary sources for social studies and history teachers, and as literary sources for English language arts teachers, and anything else that you can think of. But those are the two primary lenses. So I'm going to say something about that, and then I'm watching the time because I want to stop and try to answer some questions if I can. From the historical standpoint, diaries are primary sources, right? They can be mined for information. They contain, and we're going to spend a lot of time on this today, they contain historical details, either because the writer chose specifically to put something down, or because the diarist left breadcrumbs about, just in the reference to whatever was happening, he or she left a clue that is a way for us to grab onto something and consider, well, what does this mean? What does this tell us about the historical moment that this diary was written in? In the case of the Diaries of Salvaged Pages, there are three primary, everything's in threes. There are three primary experiences that are reflected. There are refugee diaries, there are diaries by young people in hiding, either literally hiding or passing as non-Jews, and diaries by young people in ghettos. We're not going to get to talk about all of them. Well, I guess if we in the breakout groups we will. But the way that I want you to think about it is this: when you're faced with a diary, primary sources, you or your students can, because of the way that diaries are written, because they're written day by day or week by week, in the moment as events are occurring, they tend to capture, as I said earlier, these close-up little details about daily life, the texture of daily life, the kinds of little things that would get forgotten in time. And those little details are what help us begin to understand the lived reality of that moment. Not just the big story, but what was it like in the day-to-day? And the great thing about a diary entry is that whatever diary entry it is, it can always be placed in a historical bucket. So any diary that you encounter as a teacher, you can ask yourself, well, what's the bucket? Maybe the bucket is ghettos. Maybe the bucket is Poland. Maybe the bucket is, general government because of where it's located. Maybe the bucket is hunger, starvation, or Nazi policy. But whatever it is, it's what does that individual diary touch on historically that allows you to put it in a larger context, both to better understand the diary and to show how the diary sheds light on the historical question that you're after. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's like on the history side. Now on the literature side, it's same kind of thing, but from a literary standpoint. Not every writer was a great writer. Some writers there are some Anne Franks and there are some not Anne Franks, just like in your classroom. You've got, 2 or 3 who just knock your socks off every day and you can't believe it. They're amazing. And then you have other kids who, they have good ideas. They're smart. They're interesting. It's just not their thing. It's like super hard for them to say the words, to get the words out. Every single writer who wrote a diary engaged in that fundamental gesture of picking up a pen or a pencil and using language to convey something about the human experience. And that counts whether you're good at it or not. And it has meaning whether you're good at it or not. It is more fun to read ones that are good, but that doesn't mean that ones that are sort of straightforward or not very literary or even kind of dry, that they don't contain something in them that can be revelatory. And we'll see that today because there are diaries all along the spectrum. And one of the ways to think about the value of these kinds of literary sources beyond good and bad, which is usually how we think about it, is this is the last of the threes that I'm going to throw at you. There are 3 different kinds of lenses from a literary standpoint that I think of when I think of these diaries. Writers can write about their internal world, right? They turn the gaze inward. These are entries very much like what we think of as Anne Frank's diary. It's about love, it's about family, it's about identity, it's about coming of age, it's about friendships, it's about relationships, it's about what am I going to be when I grow up, right? This is like the project of adolescence. Who am I becoming in this moment? That's the internal world. Then there's the immediate world. What's happening around me today? My family and my immediate circumstances. How are we navigating? This is like we're being kicked out of our home and we're moving to the ghetto. What are we doing from a mechanical standpoint in this moment? I'm reporting on the events of my own immediate family. And these are often times, whereas internal writing can often be very meditative and reflective, diaries that are kind of about the immediate world can often be very reporting kinds of diaries, like just the facts. I'm just getting down how we were navigating our circumstances. And then there's the external world, the broader gaze. And these are typically the most literary writings. This is the young person who sketches a scene on the ghetto street, or kind of, it's not what's happening to me, but it's what's happening to us collectively in this moment. And we'll see examples of all of these today. And some writers navigate all three of those. You can have the beginning of a diary entry could be very personal, and then it could be sketching a scene on the street, and then it could be end with, this is what's happening in my house right now. So it's not like, but some writers tend more to one or tend more to the other. And what I love to say about this is that, we always think of Anne Frank as being like the internal writer, right? Because she wrote about her relationship with her mother, and she wrote about herself and her identity and her love for Peter. But she also, people tend to forget this, she also had these amazing entries that she wrote, like where she did sort of a day in the life of the inhabitants of the hiding place, their routine. Well, that's the immediate world, right? She couldn't really write about the external world because she was cut off from the external world, but she toggles between these things. And every time she writes something about, a scare, like when somebody almost found them, or when she writes about their rescuers coming and bringing them supplies, that's the immediate world. And so it's a cliche to think that diaries are only about our inner lives. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes they become very valuable sources of information about how people navigated and survived, or very powerful literary sources about, what the bigger scene was like, almost like if you were looking at it, not as part of it, but chronicling it almost as an outsider. So that's a lot of information to throw at you. I'm going to stop for a minute and just ask if there are questions about anything I've said so far, because what we're then going to do is at a certain point soon, we're going to pivot. We're going to read a diary entry together, and I'm going to ask you to bear all these things in mind. And I'm going to try to help you see, how all of these different things that I've talked about show up in individual diaries. So let's see. No. The question is, are there slides you should be looking at? Not at this moment. I'm going to share a slide with you in a minute with a diary entry that I'll read out loud, and we'll discuss it. I'm not doing a PowerPoint with a lot of visuals, although a little bit later, I will show you some resources online for teachers that might be helpful. Are there other questions? Let's see.
If there are questions, I would say just jump in.
Yeah.
Speaking, because there's so many of us.
Yep. I refuse to believe that there are no questions. That's not possible.
I have a question.
Okay, good.
Hi.
Hi.
I came from one class to this class. So my apologies if you already addressed this.
No worries.
Did you have trouble coming up with a title for your book? And did you have other titles in mind, and what made you choose Salvage?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, I had trouble coming up with a title. I'm terrible at titles. It's my worst thing. And it was very difficult to come up with a title for this book. And one of the things that I didn't say is that this book took 10 years for me to research and write. So it was a very, very, it took my entire 20s. And when I finally, the story about the title is that the book was finished, the manuscript was finished, and it was at Yale, had accepted it, and it was at Yale, and we were going back and forth about the title. And my editor kept saying, well, we should just call it, Young Writers' Diaries of the Holocaust, which I hated. I was like, that's a subtitle, but that's not like a title. And so I was kind of panic stricken because I was running out of time. And so I sent him this email with this whole list of titles, and Salvaged Pages was in there, but I don't remember coming up with it. I don't remember it at all. I just just brainstormed and hit the send button. And he wrote back to me like a half an hour later, and he was like, Salvaged Pages. That's good. I like that. And then that was it. That was the title. So that's how it happened, which actually strikes me very funny now.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, and here's one yes, please do. And then I see one in the chat.
Were there any entries? I'm sure there were a lot that you wanted to put in but didn't make the cut.
Yeah.
But were there any that really stood out that were almost like a regret that they didn't go in to the book?
Yeah.
Because you had so much to choose from?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I should have said, but I forgot, that by the time I was ready to put Salvaged Pages together, I had found more than 55 diaries written by teenagers. And now there's probably closer to 100. And so there was, and I could only include 15. And at the time, in fact, this book was supposed to be, I was supposed to deliver a manuscript that was 500 pages long. And I delivered a manuscript that was 950 pages long because there was so much amazing material that I didn't know how to cut. And we eventually compromised at 750 pages. So I that was a victory for me. But the answer is yes, there was a huge amount of amazing material that I was not able to include. There were a couple of things. I mean, at the time, it was really hard. It felt really bad at the time. Now it's different now because so much of this material has been published since that time, right? There are diaries that I couldn't include that were eventually published in their entirety, or there's material that's available online. It was different in 2000 or 2002 than it is now. So there's nothing that I think of as like a huge regret that I wish were in the book that isn't in the book, but there are quite a number of diaries that, like the Diary of David 𝘠𝘰𝘭𝘰𝘤𝘀, which is an amazing 5-volume diary, or the Diary of 𝘏𝘰𝘶 𝘞𝘀, which was published in its entirety about Krakow Ghetto, that I'm just so relieved and so grateful that they were published as whole volumes, because I didn't include them, but it wasn't because they weren't wonderful. It was because of other considerations. They were too long, or there was too much, or I couldn't get permission, or whatever. There were lots of other reasons. Let's see. Of the 3 literary lenses, is there one that appeared most often in your research, or one that is most common? No, I don't think there is. And I think you'll see in what we read today that it's just a way of thinking about what diaries and what personal writing can do. Personal writing can be about the self, and it can be about what's happening around the self. And some writers, like the Diary of 𝘏𝘁 𝘏𝘀, which is not one that we're going to read from today, is almost entirely internal. It's very, very, very deeply reflective. The Diary of Yitzhak Rudoshevsky, whose diary we will read today, is almost entirely external. He almost never writes anything about himself. It's almost all, this sort of, it's a literary record of life in Vilna Ghetto. But most writers toggled back and forth depending on what was happening around them and whatever it was that they wanted to write about. And I find these lenses really useful, a useful way to talk to young people about their own writing as diarists, or as journal writers, that there is sort of an order to this. It's not, you can think about, as you approach, if you are going to write a diary or a journal, you can think about in any given moment, what lens you want to apply. And one of the interesting activities that I've done in writing classes is I've asked young people to choose an event and write about it from write about the same thing in 3 different ways. So choose something that happened, write about it from the internal in your internal world, your immediate world, and the external world, which can be a really wonderful writing exercise for young people to think about how you shift perspectives, what different kinds of information you present, depending on which perspective you're bringing to the event. Was there any pushback you received about releasing this book? No. I assume the question is about privacy. I'm guessing that that's the subtext of the question. The question of privacy was a big question. And it's one that I spent a lot of time on because, so some of the, I should say this, some of the writers whose diaries I included in Salvaged Pages survived, and they were able to give me permission to use their diaries and to work with me on understanding them. Some of them were loved ones had survived, and they were in a position to say, you know, yes, you can use this material, and yes, I'll work with you on it. And then in some cases, diaries were written by young people for not only did they not survive, but no one from their family survived. And they were found in archives or found by strangers and eventually given to archives. And so in those cases, you know, I think the question was, is there some overriding way, is there something about this diary that deepens the way we think about this historical past? And if so, then, you know, does that justify the inclusion of something that somebody might have viewed as a private document? And that is a legitimate and complicated question. So I'm gonna let me just look for 1 second because I'm looking at the time. It's already 5:19. The time always goes really fast. Did you find others who shared my reaction to Anne Frank's diary? Yes. So at the time that this is in the early 1990s, you know, Cynthia Ozick had already written about Anne Frank. Larry Langer had already written about Anne Frank. So some of it was my own grappling with the subject matter, and some of it was, you know, I was able to be supported in the thinking that I was, you know, my ideas by others who had come before me. And now, you know, as I said, I think the time that when Salvaged Pages came out and I wrote the introduction to it, it wasn't like the most groundbreaking idea in the world, but it wasn't commonplace. Whereas now I think it is much more common to hear people, especially people in this field, say, you know, Anne Frank's diary has great validity and great value and great meaning, but to question its legitimacy as like a single source that you know is the be all and end all for teaching the Holocaust. So I'm going to take a minute now, and I'll come back to these questions if I can when we have, like, as we go. But right now, what I want to do is I'm going to share my screen, and give me 1 second to do this. See if I can do this in an elegant way. Hold on 1 second. Okay, I'm going to share. I have no idea what you all are going to see. You're going to see my dog. This always happens. I always try to get it like in the right position, and it never is. That's my dog Lulu. Okay. So can everybody see? Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see? Okay, good. All right. So this is the diary. This is a photograph of a young boy called Klaus Langer with his mother. He was a German Jewish boy writing in Essen, Germany. And he wrote an amazing series of entries about Kristallnacht. He wrote in the late 1930s in Germany. Very assimilated family. His father was a judge. His parents had lots of non-Jewish friends. His father had fought in World War I, kind of the classic archetypal German Jewish family. I really didn't quite see the Nazi threat for what it was until a bit late. So I'm going to read this entry, and then I want to sort of lead you through a discussion of it. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just while I'm reading, Note down, preferably in writing, anything that jumps out at you, whether it's a phrase or a thought, an idea, anything that you find interesting, surprising, curious, notable, because I'm going to take it off the screen so that I can have a dialogue with you about it. And we're going to take this entry apart and talk about what it yields from, in particular from a historical standpoint, but also to some extent from a literary one, and just try to model a little bit how you can use an individual diary entry to get at some broader historical threads that are deeply significant and important to this history. So this is December 19th, 1938. Klaus was 14 at the time that he wrote this entry. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, in which the Essen synagogue was burned, he wrote, as I said, at length about that and about the destruction of his parents' property. His father was arrested, as 30,000 Jewish men and boys were, held for a time in prison, and then released on the condition that he leave, that they emigrate from Germany, which was very common. And so the parents were trying to figure out an immigration plan for themselves. And Klaus, who was very connected to the Jewish community, was trying to find his own, figure out if there was a way for him to get out through some of the youth movement. So this particular entry is about his parents' efforts to leave. December 19th, 1938. Regarding the immigration of my parents, I have the following to report. First came 2 refusals from Argentina for lack of letters of credit. The rich uncle in America is unable to assume such a financial responsibility. We don't have an affidavit for the US. India requires firm employment there or a contract. Father is now trying to make connections in India to obtain a contract. He also wrote to Peru and was told to go to the Uruguayan consulate. Allegedly, the Dominican Republic would take 10,000 Jews and provide them with visas. However, nothing further is known about that. It probably makes no sense to turn to them. However, with a Dominican Republic visa, it is possible to get a half-year visa for Palestine. Shanghai also accepts Jews, even without a visa, but it is questionable how one can live there. The mail also brought no news from Palestine. We had submitted a request for a commercial certification. So I'm just going to give you a minute with this on the screen. Just make notes of anything that you find interesting. So what did you notice? Anybody who wants to can just chime in, or you can ask to be called on in the chat if that's easier. But I want to start a dialogue. The use of we in the last sentence. Okay, good. Shanghai also accepts Jews even without a visa, but it is questionable how one can live there. Turns nose up to viable options. Okay, so who said that? Melissa Schwartz. Where's Melissa? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, just at the time, there were such difficulties getting out of the country, and yet they're turning their nose up to such viable options.
So say more about turning their nose up.
Well, just the fact that, they're looking at Shanghai as not being a viable option.
Does anybody have a thought about why he might have said that Shanghai wasn't a viable option?
Because there was a war happening in China at the time.
Okay, so one thing is that there was a war happening, right? What else?
They probably don't speak the language in Shanghai, the Dominican Republic, and I forget the other place that he listed.
Right. So let's stay with Shanghai for a minute, because it's really it's an important piece. So I think what's interesting is the language of turning up. When you say they turned up their nose at viable options, the implication is that they should have recognized the situation for what it was and taken the opportunity that was presented to them, or that they were somehow being maybe careless or irresponsible by not grabbing the opportunity that was presented to them. And it is interesting because he says, you know, it sort of stops you in your tracks, right? He says, he lists all these different places, right? And it's like, no, no Uruguay, no India, no Palestine, no Peru, no, what other places? No US. And then he says, Shanghai takes Jews without a visa. And you think, what? Why aren't you already on a boat to Shanghai? But it is questionable how one can live there. So what are the reasons? We talked about this. There's a war going on. How is his father going to make a living? They don't speak the language. It's a complete unknown. And from Klaus's perspective, and this is what I always hope that young people will take away from this entry, we know now that they would have been lucky to get on a boat and be on their way to Shanghai. But there was no way for Klaus and his family to know that. For all they knew, that was a foolish and reckless thing to do. Or for all they knew, circumstances might blow over or another opportunity might present itself. So one of the amazing and great things about Diaries is that it allows you to inhabit for a moment the mindset of the person who is writing and to consider all the complexities. And I see a lot of things that people are saying here that are quite right. They thought they still had time, right? That there's a sense of blame, a similar situation in considering Palestine. So the idea that, you know, here are all these places, all of which are saying no, and that, you know, they're not, we have to remember, and your students have to be reminded that this is November of 1938. The war has not been declared yet. There is no Auschwitz. There is no, Wannsee hasn't happened. There's no way for someone in this moment to have understood the universe within their universe of possibility, where events were going to go. And this is a challenge that we have all the time. And you know this because your students say to you, I know they do, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they just leave? And the question that you have to ask them is, what do you mean by the word just? What does just mean? It's always, why didn't they just leave? When in fact, the question is, what's involved in leaving? Leaving your home, your family, your language, your livelihood, everything that is known and familiar to you. If you can get out to begin with, which is a whole other story. So let's shift gears for 1 second and talk about this list of places, which is so powerful, and not just the list of places, but the list of documents that are required. One of the things that students, I've had teachers have done with their students is to take this list of countries, assign 3 or 4 kids to each one, and have them go off and research immigration, their immigration policy and laws at the time, and then come back and report, well, this is the paperwork you needed. This is what was required in order, this was the quota that was allowed for Jews in this particular place and time. And what you see, of course, is that there's no just getting out. Getting out was incredibly difficult. The other thing that I think is really worth thinking about is, and when I talked earlier about like the bucket, the idea of the bucket. So one of the buckets here is, you know, late 1930s Germany. Another bucket is the Avion Conference, right? Which is this diary entry is the 100% trickle down effect of the Avion Conference. Here's the Avion Conference, and all these representatives from all these governments are sitting around, and they're talking about how they're not going to increase their quotas, and they're not going to take any Jews. Sorry, we can't do it. I'm sorry, we can't do it. I'm sorry, we can't do it. And a year, 2 years later, here's Klaus, who himself is trying to get out. And this is how those policies literally trickle down to an individual person. And so studying Avion and talking about what these different countries said and did in that context is also very, very powerful. I noticed, I mean, these comments are great. I hope you all are looking at them because I can't, right, there's a question of finances. It's much harder to do this with the, okay, we're going to talk about just the facts because people are saying he's taking just the facts attitude, sounding kind of passive aggressive, but beginning to feel desperate. Okay, I can't read all of them because I'll bore you guys while I sit and look at all your comments. I'm going to look at all of them afterwards. Writing is lacking in emotion. So interesting. All right, we're going to talk about that in a second, the literary piece of this, or his voice, let's say. But let's talk about the rich uncle for a minute. Anybody want to say something about the rich uncle? Why didn't Klaus just say, my uncle can't take us in?
Can I say something?
Please.
Okay. I just thought it was a little a hint of sarcasm, and I found it kind of humorous. Just like,
Yeah.
oh, the rich uncle couldn't bear the responsibility. Sorry, like I
It's a little bit of a
detected
dig.
a lot of digs and sarcasm in there.
Yeah,
and
it's a little bit of a dig. Yeah,
just how a 14-year-old works through things and processes with that sarcasm and his view and what he has access to versus his parents viewing the same things and what, you know, what your scope is at 14 years old.
Right. So let's talk about that, because one of the things that is so powerful and wonderful about Diaries is that they allow you to sort of use what I think of as kind of historical imagination, right? What you get from the diary is not always the whole story, but it can open a lot of questions. And as long as those questions are in line with what is historically possible, they're legitimate questions to ask. So when Klaus says the rich uncle in America is unable to assume such a financial responsibility, he's clearly digging a little bit at the uncle, right? But what are some of the other reasons why the uncle might not have been able to take them? Let's just parse this out a little bit. What's happening in America in 1938?
The Great Depression.
Right, it's the Great Depression. What else? What's American refugee policy?
You have anti-immigration policies since the 1920s, the Johnson-Reed Act, which put quotas on particular immigrants.
Exactly. So we know that, you know, maybe he's a jerk and he wouldn't take them in, but maybe he lost all his money in the Depression. Maybe he couldn't take them in because of American immigration policy, which was incredibly restrictive. Maybe he had already sponsored a family. Maybe he had a falling out with Klaus's father and he didn't want to take them. Maybe any number of things could be behind this entry that we don't know. The point is not which of them is true. The point is that all of them give you a way to have your students consider something important about the history. So when they see this is like one of these little breadcrumbs that I was talking about. It's a way for you to say, well, let's talk about American immigration policy. Let's talk about the Great Depression. Let's talk about what was happening in America at this moment that might explain this point of view beyond the interpersonal or beyond the chance that the uncle was just like not a nice guy or not a generous guy, but that maybe there was some other piece of the story that really, you know, that they can learn something from. We're never going to know why the rich uncle didn't take them in, but we can ask our students to think, you know, what can we say? What can we learn about America, or what can we consider about this sort of, it's almost like, I always think of it like a little door floats open for you. That's like a little door, and you can go through and say like, we're gonna spend a little time in America in the 1930s now, and we're gonna get a handle on this, and we're gonna come back to the entry, and maybe we're gonna go into Shanghai a little bit. We're gonna look at Shanghai and why was it the way it was, and why might they have viewed the circumstances the way that they did. So the other thing that I think is interesting in looking at this is that the question of Klaus's voice. So some people viewed, yes, reporter lens, exactly. Some people viewed Klaus as being kind of like, well, I heard passive aggressive. That's a new one. I've never heard that before, but that he was, he's kind of dry, right? It's like very reporting. There's not a lot of emotion in this entry. And I will just reassure you that if you read the whole diary, you'll see there's a lot of emotion later on, you know, as things heat up and things get more desperate. But, oh, that's a good question. Sorry, I forgot about the rich uncle. What is rich in America? Rich uncle may be a stereotype. That's another really important piece of this is that I forgot to say, which is that Klaus may assume that everybody in America is rich, right? It's not, I mean, maybe his uncle wasn't rich at all. Or as I said, maybe he was rich and he lost all his money. The other thing that a student once said to me that completely blew my mind was maybe the rich uncle is Uncle Sam. Maybe it's like code basically for America won't take us in, which is brilliant. And again, like, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is that somebody was able to put that thought together and consider like, right, America was in an isolationist mode, and America was making it incredibly difficult for immigrants to come in, and America didn't want to take on the financial responsibility. And so there's truth in that, even if that's not the actual explanation for that particular thing. So this diary is a great example of this kind of reporting of the immediate world, right? He's not writing about his own emotions right now, and he's not writing about anything outside of his family. He's just reporting on what's happening around him. And I think it's important to say that, you know, diarists don't owe us their personal feelings about things. That's not necessarily what a diary is. Diarists don't owe their diaries anything. And this diary, while we don't get much of an emotional charge from it, it has a lot of information in it. And for that reason, it's enormously valuable. I personally view Klaus's reserve, the reserve in his voice and the control, to be very revealing. Because to me, it says, this is a 14-year-old boy who's much older than his years, who has a command not only of geography, but of geopolitics, who is reporting on a very fraught issue, which is, are his parents going to be able to get out of Nazi Germany? And he's documenting it. To me, it feels like he's marking it all down in order to have some control over what's happening. He wants to notate what the options are, what's been ruled out, what's still in the mix, what the variables are. And, you know, I don't know how many of you are list makers, but, you know, from an absolute like inveterate list maker, I gain a lot of, it's very reassuring to me to sort of mark down the universe of possibilities for me in any given day, for example. And so this feels like that. That's how I interpret it, but not everybody has to interpret it that way. It seemed like he was growing up fast. Yes, definitely. Yeah, many of my students won't believe that Klaus was 14 because he's so mature. And this is true across the board. You know, you see that these writers are writing at a level that is really very sophisticated for their, you know, for their age. And I think a lot of it is because, you know, they came from many of them came from a literary tradition. They had very high expectations academically, especially as somebody like Klaus. And there was no TV. So they were automatically not, they were reading instead of watching. So is there anything else that anybody wants to say about, I'm just gonna scroll through here and make sure that I'm not missing anything. Right. Our students might find it hard to understand that in America, we have the choice to just leave, but in Germany during this time, you needed permission visas to leave and enter another country. That's right. And also not only that, something else that I didn't say, which is that, you know, of course, the Germans, the Nazis made sure to strip people of every dime, every mark that they had as they were leaving. So it wasn't that the Germans didn't want Jews to leave. They were happy for them to leave. But it was very difficult to find a place that would take them, and they would be completely impoverished on the way out. They would sell their businesses at a loss. They would sell their property at a loss. They were taxed enormously. They had to, and just the sheer logistics of getting out, of having all of your papers line up and having your quota and your medical papers and your boat ticket and your affidavit and somebody on the other side who was willing to take you in, and having all of those things lined up. All of those things were obstacles. But the thing that I think that the very first person, Melissa, who said something about Klaus turning up his nose, I think you are touching on something really important, and I want to finish with this, and then we'll take a little break. We talk a lot, and it's very important to impress upon students the external obstacles that people face. That's what we've been talking about, right? We're talking about how could you navigate this situation? Making the decision to leave. When do you leave? Is now the right time? The risk of impoverishment and the question of uncertainty on the other side, then actually finding a place that will take you, then navigating all the paperwork and all the other things, and actually being able to get out. That's one thing. But what Melissa was really referring to, I think, and some of the others who commented in the chat box are the internal obstacles. That what Klaus touches on when he says, you know, we could go to Shanghai even without a visa, but it's questionable how one can live there. What he's really talking about is his own understanding of his place in the world. That the last thing that people had to let go of when they were fleeing was the belief in their own entitlements, right? So like for me as an American Jew, I don't think of myself as somebody whose entitlements and rights and privileges in America are in doubt. I believe that I am entitled to liberty and the right to pursue a business and to do whatever, get married who I want, whatever it was. For German Jews, they were exactly like us in that regard. They were totally assimilated. The father, as I said, had fought in World War I. He was a judge in the German legal system, judicial system. So for them to understand that they would be lucky to get out with the shirt on their back and to go to a faraway place where they didn't speak the language, that was also living in a war, where they had no idea what was going to happen to them, meant that they had to understand themselves in a completely different way. They had to not only navigate the external obstacles, but also their internal belief structure. And this is what I think got in the way of so many German Jews who delayed and delayed and delayed. And you don't see this in the same way among Eastern European Jews who frankly were used to, you know, centuries upon centuries of being marginalized and persecuted and excluded and attacked for no reason. You know, there's one eye always on guard, but that was not the case for the German Jews. And this thread is so important for students to understand. It runs through the whole diary. There's a part in the diary where Klaus says he's talking about preparing to emigrate to Palestine, and he says, I'm going to submit to take my bike and my cello. You know, and you realize like he has no idea. Like he has absolutely no idea that there's no way he's taking his bike and his cello. He's not moving somewhere. He's fleeing for his life. And that is all the difference in the world. And it was not an easy thing for people to understand. And I think what I want for your students is for them to have compassion and empathy for that, to understand what those circumstances were, so that when they walk out of the conversation, the question is no longer, you know, why didn't they just leave? Or why didn't they understand, you know, that they would be lucky to get out? But it's, you know, what an incredibly difficult thing it is to do, to understand that the moment has come and you have to go. And part of the reason why that's so important is that, you know, this is we live in a time where there are refugees, millions and millions and millions of refugees everywhere. And understanding what Klaus and his family went through and understanding how difficult it was for them might increase our capacity to understand what is so difficult and so challenging for people who are trying to find and build a new life in a new country in the present day. So with that, I'm going to stop. I think we should take a break until 6. Get up, have a drink, any kind of drink, have a snack. And then I'm going to turn my camera off for a minute, and then I'm going to come back a couple minutes before 6. And Jackie and I, Jackie's going to help. She's actually going to do it. We're going to pretend that she's helping, but she's actually going to do it to get you all into breakout groups to talk about diaries in a little bit of a smaller context, which I hope will be a little more comfortable. So everybody take a break. I'll see you in a few.